All right, in our last video here, the Lord's Supper. We've been talking about who is worthy to receive it. Obviously, as Luther rightfully explained, those who recognize the very body and blood of Christ, who understand it, who have been instructed, who with penitent hearts that are sorrowful over their sin, recognize that in this supper they've been invited to receive the grace of God for the forgiveness of sins. And again, that Christ's body and blood are present there, that sacrifice for our redemption. With that, one last thought. The Lord's Supper is such a humble thing, right? It's just bread and a little bit of wine. To human reason, it seems like a mere ceremony. It's kind of like baptism that way. It's just water. Outwardly thinking, right? Humanly speaking. In fact, all the ways, though, that God comes to us and saves us, whether through a humble word or a less than polished video, through the Holy Scriptures, which is an old book, or a cross upon which the Son of God died, such humiliation. I mean, isn't that how God comes to us? Always comes to us in humble ways. He's not interested in impressing us like the way the world tries to with big and extravagant things. So, all of the ways that God often works and imparts this grace to us, it seems foolish in the eyes of the world, apart from faith. But isn't this exactly how God works? God chooses the weak things of the world to humble people, to shame the wise, who are full of pride and think they don't need a God. And why does God work through such humble things? Well, because in the end, we're all going to be humiliated in death. We're going to be shown to have no real power at all. And everything we've been holding on to in a worldly sense that's so powerful, so amazing, so extravagant, it's going to let us down. It cannot save. But the humble things of God can meet us in our humility, our humiliation in the hour of our death, and, surprise, surprise, save us. So the foolishness of God is wiser than man's strength. All right. What other things does God call us to receive, observe, and obey that are also so very humble? I named a lot. Can you think of any more? What other things does God put before us that are humble, but we know are good, and calls us to believe, calls us to live out, calls us into position of various vocations or callings in life, the work that we have to do? All these things that might be humble are from God, aren't they? As you think about that, I'm going to read you a few passages to, again, sum up our discussion. Matthew 18, 3-4. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." In other words, to have a childlike faith is to believe things that are seemingly absurd, things that seem foolish. With God, though, childlike faith sees these are not foolish at all. And Jesus says that's a requirement to enter into his kingdom, to have such a faith. Matthew 20:26. "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." Think about all the things God might call you into. Whether a mother is to change diapers, or a father who does, or a father who doesn't live for himself, but brings home a paycheck so that he can give it away to his children, to his family, or a mother who works only to provide. All the humble things in this life, stooping down to help someone else, to tie someone's shoes, or to wash their feet, or to take care of the elderly, or whatever, all these humble things, that's where God's at work. That's what God calls us to. And that's what Jesus is saying here about his kingdom. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Or John 13:5, after he shared about the Lord's Supper and all these things, or at least prepared for the Passover, and spoke to his disciples, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and dry them with the towel that was around him. He himself humbled himself. He came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That's really all illustrated in the Lord's Supper. And people who come to the Lord's Supper are to have that same mindset, to be humble so that God might lift them up through his very presence. All right, I hope you feel you've been blessed through a review of the Lord's Supper. With that, we're going to round our conversation out with one last thought. Luther does well in describing how we can prepare for the Lord's Supper. Look for a video or look up the Luther address on that in the Small Catechism to regularly be reminded how to prepare for the Lord's Supper. In a lot of hymnals, that is also written so that we might prepare before communion in a service. God bless.